Well, I think that the world has always been connected to each other for the last 2,500 years. We can see global trading patterns where goods travel from North Africa to Scotland, from China to the Mediterranean and back again. And sometimes politicians and the media want to give an explanation for why the world is changing. My view is that the problem or the issue is not really about globalization. It's about really big shifts of global power, and particularly about the rise of Asia, which is the most populated continent in the world by a long, long way. And I think that sometimes when we see the world changing, we get scared, and therefore we give answers and responses that come not from the head, but from the heart. But I think we're going through a period of great change in the world, but there's nothing that's not unusual, that's not difficult, that's not strange. The world always shifts and moves around. A lot depends on where populations are, where natural resources are, where markets are. The market plays an important role in bringing and matching supply and demand together. So I think that in some ways, some of the reaction of Brexit and with Trump is entirely logical, that this has been a very good last 30 or 40 years, particularly in places like China, where, according to the World Bank, maybe 700 million people have come out of the poverty line. The standard of living in China has dramatically changed. And that has also been as a result of China's rise, as a result of more difficult conditions elsewhere in the world. So there is some logic to it, but how one stops it, or to think that you can stop it, is a different question. Yes, well, I think China is at a crossroads. It needs to decide, China, whether it is a properly global power, and being a global power brings with it responsibilities and a different way of behaving. I think if China wants to lead in the global community, ways you have to learn how to do that, and that means deciding how to get involved in many, many difficult questions. For example, how does one deal with the Middle East? How does one deal with the rise of religious fundamentalism? I think that these processes, again, are ones that are very regular in global history, whether at the end of the Second World War, the new international order, where the United Nations was set up. I think that where Africa is on the move, and the Americas and Asia. Well, I think when we think of the Silk Roads, we think always of, particularly in China, we think of China going west. But things go in every direction. And when you study the Silk Roads, you learn it's not just about infrastructure and investment and financial exchange. When you talk and cooperate with your neighbours, then you learn ideas about food, about fashion, about technology, about ideas, about religions. And I think when One Belt, One Road, this huge scale of investment comes next door, it's sometimes very difficult to invest a large amount of money very, very quickly, because everybody wants things to change quickly, but patience and time is the most important thing, because things that change overnight can produce fragility, they can produce problems in the future. And one of the great things and challenges with One Belt, One Road is to understand what subsidiary problems and opportunities it will create. If you study the Silk Roads, you learn that it's a very complicated jigsaw, but all of the pieces are connected to each other. And it can be tempting to only see this as China leading, but it's entirely right to think in terms of win-win and mutual benefit. Well, I think it's fair to say that we in Europe we're talking only about how to cooperate less. We're trying to work out how regional cooperation maybe has been a mistake, and that we should have our own separate identities. So in China, One Belt, One Road, but also with Russia, Central Asian republics, Iran and South Asia, there's a lot of discussion about how to improve ties, and that looks to me very different to what's happening in Europe. So I think that the change in Asia is incredibly important. You know, that's the same for the Romans, the same for the British Empire, and it's a very sensible thing to be doing, to find a way of using your ability to fund infrastructure to upgrade places that you have a natural mutual interest in. But everything now depends on how the plan is put into place. Everything depends on what specific projects do. And I think a lot depends also on when things go wrong, how do you learn from them? And because we only learn from mistakes. And I think that we sometimes forget that difficult lessons can sometimes be very positive. It depends how self-critical you can be, and it depends how honest you can be with some of these changes and investments. But I think that if everything works out, there's potential for a very bright future across all of the spine of Asia, because this is how people have always communicated and exchanged with each other.